right, good morning, everyone. How we doing? All right, we are awake this morning. That is good. Well, can't tell yet. This morning is kind of a special Sunday for churches across the world. It is called Palm Sunday, as you can tell. One of the jokes I like to make is that here in Southern California, every Sunday is Palm Sunday. Only a couple people get that, but that's okay. Anyway, so the video there kind of encapsulates what is normally talked about on Palm Sunday, which is absolutely true. But I want to take this morning a little bit of a different look at probably than what you hear in a Palm Sunday. If you with us, we've been going through the book 1 Corinthians, which is this letter that Paul wrote to a church 2,000 years ago. And so we are going to go back to that. Chapter 1, I skipped over it 2 months ago, knowing that we would land there for Palm Sunday. And so usually Palm Sunday, people talk about Jesus. He enters into Jerusalem on a Sunday, the start of Holy Week. There was a huge festival going on that time in Jerusalem. And instead of entering in kind of this big white, army victorious horse, Jesus comes in on a donkey. And so everyone is, waving palm branches. That's why we had the kids do that. And Jesus makes his entrance. And kind of the main point of Palm Sunday is this, that Jesus was not the Messiah. He was not the king that they expected him to be. He showed up in a way where he was saying, hey, yeah, I'm king, I'm victorious. Is my mic going in and out? Okay. You can get it back up maybe in the back and we'll go from there. So that is said on Palm Sunday. And that is all true and that's great, but probably the more trickier thing and the more crazy thing about Palm Sunday is not what happens on Sunday, but what Jesus is going towards. Because not only did Jesus mess with their minds on Palm Sunday, but he messed with their minds knowing, can I just take this off? Cool. He messed with their minds knowing that he was going to the cross. And you want something that would mess with people's minds, a king dying on a cross was far more unexpected than coming in on a donkey. So before we start this morning, here's what I want you to visualize. There are crosses everywhere in our culture today, okay? Let me name a couple examples. People wear crosses for a fashion symbol, right? So on their earrings, a shirt. I would imagine there's probably a couple people in here who have tattoos, and there's a cross on your tattoo. Maybe you have it on your bicep. I don't know. There's tons of church buildings that have crosses on them, right? I mean, Christians we have these great cliche bumper stickers on our cars that have crosses. It's kind of funny. We were talking about this as a staff a couple weeks ago. I guess some people in here were wanting the new bridge logo as a bumper sticker on the car. The only thing about that is that if you're a bad driver, we don't want that to be associated with the bridge. So be very, very careful if we make a bridge bumper sticker and you decide to put that on, because we all know what happens after that. So crosses everywhere in our culture. Fashion symbols, tattoos, church buildings, bumper stickers, you name it, there's a cross. Here's what I want you to do now. Replace that image of a cross with a gas chamber or an electric chair. We're gonna put up some pictures here. So if you don't know what a gas chamber looks like, there's one. They're very lovely looking. Do we have the electric chair? There we go. Genesis 1:1-3 has nothing to do with that. Anyways, so that's a different translation that we don't follow. Now here, do this. You got your cross earrings. Imagine those being electric chair earrings. You got a cross tattoo on your bicep. Would you put a gas chamber there? Would you put an electric chair or a gas chamber on the back of your car? Now, you're probably thinking like, okay, this is pretty extreme stuff, Mark. But here's what I want you to see this morning as we make into our passage. That's exactly the thought, the process, and the reaction that the first century would have had to a supposed king on Palm Sunday who ends up nailed to a cross. It did not make sense. Let's go to our passage. 1 Corinthians chapter 1. Like I said, we are moving back 14 chapters. We saved this for Palm Sunday, chapter 1, verses 18 through 31. We'll have it up on the screen. Here's what Paul writes to this community an hour and a half or so outside of Athens, Greece. He says, "For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. But to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise. The intelligence of the intelligent I will frustrate. Where is the wise person? Where is the teacher of the law? Where is the philosopher of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not know him, God was pleased through the foolishness of what was preached to save those who believe. Jews demand signs and Greeks look for wisdom. Remember that. But we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. But to those whom God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength." Paul uses some pretty fancy, confusing, sophisticated language here. And that is why I wanted to start off this with kind of you visualizing, instead of a cross, a gas chamber or an electric chair. Because the cross, what Palm Sunday is leading up to, not only was Palm Sunday unexpected in how Jesus entered, but where he was going was far, far more unexpected. Actually, in the first century culture, they would have said it's moronic. The word foolishness there, let me read it again. Paul says this in verse 18, "For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing." The word moron that we use, that is the Greek word, foolishness, that we derive the word moron from. So there are morons in the Bible. So Paul's like, hey, the cross is moronic. It's stupid. It's madness. It's crazy. It doesn't make sense. And then there's a whole other group, the Jewish people, and we'll get into this category, that not only do they think it's foolishness, but they're saying it's a scandal. It's offensive. It's a stumbling block. And I know for some of us, kind of the way I open this, it seems maybe in some ways kind of crass, in that for us as Western Americans in 2019, I mean, the cross is kind of this holy central symbol, right? I mean, we've kind of lost sense of actually what it stands for. And so we come to this and you're like, what? Like, why is the cross foolishness? I mean, to call the cross moronic, that seems like that's a big statement. So what's going on in their mind? What's the deal here with the Corinthians that Paul is writing to? Basically, here's what's going on. Paul divides all of humanity into two categories. First category, he says, is Greeks or Gentiles, everyone that's not Jewish. And that kind of stands for pop culture, culture at large, group number one. The other side of humanity is Jewish people. Think of them in this sense as kind of the people of God, the church, the religious people of the day. Those are the two categories that Paul is working with in this passage. And so he says this, verse 22, He says, Jews demand signs and Greeks look for wisdom. That is the whole backdrop to this passage. So let me deal with the Greeks over here. We went over this about 2 months ago. So Greeks, Gentiles, pop culture in large, first century, one of their biggest values was like eloquent speech, was oratory, was the ability to sound smart, just to talk a lot. That was like a huge priority in that culture. And it was frankly obnoxious. I mean, they would just kind of talk on and on for no reason. What celebrities and athletes are today is what philosophers were back then. If you were a philosopher and you just loved to hear yourself talk and to go on and on, I mean, those were like the celebrities of the first century culture. And they just talked in vanity. It was meaningless stuff. I joke with my wife, Rachel, she can't stand that I listen to like AM sports talk radio in the car. And so she thinks, man, these people are just running their mouths. Like, what are they talking about? They're stupid. They just want to hear themselves talk. They don't make sense, blah, 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 blah. Any wives feel this way here? Wow, only a couple. Oh, Katie, both hands. Come on, Rob. So that was kind of like philosophers in the first century, but that's what was valued. And so here's the interesting thing. It wasn't so much about them sounding smart, although that was part of it, because if you could talk a lot, it meant that you were educated, which meant that you were wealthy, which meant that you were upper class. But the thing is, it wasn't necessarily about that. It was actually more about showing off your status. Showing off that you're kind of like a celebrity, that you're upper class. It was really all about glory, fame, and honor. It was their way of showing off. And the culture worshiped and valued that. So, on a side note, I know sometimes I've heard conversations of this passage where people think that Paul is saying here, oh, if you become a Christian, you need to leave your brain at the door. Right? Like, oh, the cross is foolishness. It doesn't make sense. You can't use reason. That's not what Paul's saying here, just as a quick note. I think Christianity makes the most sense, reason, and I think Paul would say the same thing. He's not saying to leave your brain at the door. He's saying that is not... It's not about status. It's not about image. It's not about glory and fame and honor and your ability to talk. Going back to this passage now, here's the question. If you were a philosopher in the first century, do you think it would be persuasive and eloquent and fancy to talk about a God who became human and then died on a cross? Would that increase the ratings of your sports talk radio show? It wouldn't. This is why for them, they say foolishness, moronic, dumb. Why would we talk about that? That is pop culture at large, the Greeks. Second category, the Jews over here, the religious people, the people of God. Paul says this about them. Jews demand signs, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block. Another little fun hint here. The Greek word for stumbling block is scandalon, where we get the word scandal or scandalous. And it literally means here for you to trip over something. And so when Paul says here that Christ crucified is a stumbling block, he's saying they can't accept it. They're going to trip over it. It's scandalous. It's offensive. Why? And this gets to the heart of Palm Sunday. Because if you were a Jewish person, you wanted your Messiah to walk into Jerusalem on a big, white, strong horse that represented and said out loud, I am here to kill off Rome. Israel's going to have victory. We're going to take over this land, and we are here to rule. It was a military victory. That's what they wanted for their Messiah. See, Messiah meant victorious, triumphant, strong. Crucified meant weak, humble, loss. So to say, as Paul does here, a crucified Messiah, to put those two words together, I mean, that was literally a contradiction. What one scholar writes, it'd be like saying fried rice. It'd be like saying a square circle. It'd be like saying USC actually has a good athletic program. And they cheat. Anyway, sorry. I'm not sorry. Who here is a USC fan? Yes, fight on. Cunningham's. Anyways, so in the first century, a cross, I mean, that symboled complete defeat. The number one way that Rome wanted to crush a movement and just kind of defeat them and get them to shut up was to crucify someone. Slaves and rebels ended up on a cross. I mean, Jesus died as a state criminal. And it was a loud message from Rome saying, we've won, not you. So, if you're a Jewish person, and this person is claiming to be your Messiah, and they walk into Jerusalem on Sunday, palm branches are being waved, the last thing on your mind is 5 days later, you're there. Because that meant game over. Now, here's the interesting thing that Paul does. He says, hey, the cross is foolishness for pop culture and is foolishness for God's people. He's like, I'm going to take you one step further. I'm going to use your own medicine to make my argument. So they value wisdom and sounding smart, and then over here they value power and victory. What Paul's going to say this morning, and here's the point. The wisdom and power that you're looking for is actually found in the cross. The wisdom and power that you've been seeking for your whole life is actually fulfilled on the Messiah crucified. Let me reread verse 18 now. Look for these words: wisdom, showing off, rhetorical flair, and power. Verse 18, let me read out loud. But to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, the intelligence of the intelligent I will frustrate. And Paul's like, where's the wise person? Where's the teacher of the law? Which is like a Jewish theologian. Where's the philosopher of this age? Calling out the Greeks. Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? I mean, Paul, he's making fun of them. He's talking trash. He's like, you guys ain't nothing. I mean, kind of like the phrase in the 90s, who's your daddy? That's kind of what Paul's doing right here. He's like, you guys got nothing. He says this, for a follower of Jesus, verse 24, but to those whom God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength. I mean, this reminds me, out on the children's playground, like if you're in kindergarten or something, what's the typical argument? Well, my dad is better than yours. Well, you know what? My dad can beat up your dad. Paul's going back and forth with them. I love a modern translation of this. Let me read this for you. This really gets at it. Human wisdom is so tiny, so helpless, next to the seeming absurdity of God. Human strength can't begin to compete with God's weakness. Okay. All right, Paul, so we get your argument. We get it. We're tracking along. Here's the thing. Maybe you're sitting here and you're like, well, now that I think about it, yeah, the cross does kind of seem a little illogical. I mean, you ever thought about that? I mean, I think a lot of Christians, we are just so desensitized to the cross because it's become a cultural symbol that it's just a symbol to us. But then you start to think through it logically. It's like, okay, yeah, how does God save the world through a cross? Paul, smart man, he knows the Corinthians are thinking that. He anticipates their question. So he says, let me give you an illustration. I think this may be the most sarcastic section of Paul's letters that we have in the scriptures. This is brutal. So remember, they're probably thinking, okay, Paul, show us how that is the wisdom and power of God. He's like, okay, you want to go there? Here's what he says, verse 26. Consider your own call, brothers and sisters. Not many of you were wise by human standards. So he says, you guys are actually stupid. Not many were powerful. So he's calling them weak. And then he says, not many were of noble birth. Basically, what Paul just said is you guys, talking to the Corinthians, are a bunch of nobodies. You're not wise, you're not strong, and you didn't come from a noble family. But, verse 27, but God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, things that are not, things that don't even exist, to reduce to nothing that things are. Why? So that no one might boast in the presence of God. He is the source of your life in Christ Jesus, who became for us wisdom and righteousness and sanctification and redemption, in order that, as it is written, let the one who boasts, boast in the Lord. In simple, short language, Paul's like, you want proof that the cross is the wisdom and power of God? Look at yourself. You're not smart, you're not strong, and you came from a worthless family. I mean, talk about a blow. Here's what Paul says. You guys are a bunch of nobodies, but because of the cross, Jesus has made you a somebody. See, the foot of the cross is equal. The cross is the giant leveler. And the church is proof of that. It's common in the last decade for the church, the global church, to receive a lot of flack, bad reputation, and some of that honestly is deserved. That's a different conversation. But here's one of the things. The church is going to be stupid. Why? Because it's filled of a bunch of nobodies. Here's what I find more amazing, is where in the world do you find a community that is so diverse, different gender, economic status, ethnic, social relations, whatever. Think about all the differences in the world. Gender, economic standing, cultural, racial. And where's the one place in the world where all those differences gather together and sit together in unity for a couple hours a week and then go care for each other during the week and hang out in a life group? I, for one, can't think of another organization like that. I mean, especially in our times now, our political culture is as polarized as ever, regardless of which side you're on. But to come together in diversity and differences, that doesn't happen anymore. It's foolish. You know what else is foolish? I'll never forget, there was a guy in a previous church that I was at, unemployed for 2 years straight. And that dude found complete joy and hope and security in Jesus Christ, even though he was unemployed for 2 years. There wasn't a happier person than him. That's foolish. You know what else is foolish? It's when you have a couple that's been married and one of the spouses cheats on the other one, and the spouse that's hurt, and deservingly so, says, you know what? I'm gonna work to forgive you, and we're gonna stick this out and make this work. Foolishness! That doesn't make sense anywhere else. The church is foolish because the cross doesn't make sense. But that's the gospel. See, the cross actually is offensive, but it's offensive for all the right reasons. Tim Keller says this. This is a beautiful quote, one of my favorite quotes of all time. He says, the gospel is this: we are more sinful and flawed in ourselves than we ever dared believe. Here's what that means. You're more jacked up, I'm more jacked up than I think. Yet at the very same time, we are more loved and accepted in Jesus Christ than we ever dared hope. Here's what the cross, here's what Palm Sunday, here's what the gospel says: that you are more broken than you know, but you are more loved than you can imagine because of Jesus Christ. That's offensive because it says you're jacked up. But it's powerful because there's no one who loves you more than Jesus. God is so wise, he is so powerful, that he intentionally set up the good news, what we call the gospel, so that it is very clear, black and white, who to trust, who you should boast in. That's the whole point of this passage. That's why Paul says, verse 27, but God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. He chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. He chose what is low and despised, things that are not, to reduce to nothing things that are. Why? So that no one may boast in the presence of God. He is the source of your life in Christ Jesus. Jesus became for you wisdom from God, righteousness, sanctification, redemption, in order that, as is written, if you haven't gotten it yet, let the one who boasts, boast in the Lord. The word boast here, it means, what do you glory in? What do you find honor in? It comes really close to meaning this: where do you put your trust? Where do you find your security? If you want to find out where you put your trust, where you put your security, what are the things that you risk to find security? We talk about Paul's talking to two groups here in this passage: the Greeks, pop culture at large, the Jewish people, the church. Now let me practically go through each of those for us today. Pop culture. Now, philosophers aren't the celebrities today. If you're a nerd in here, I'm sorry. You're born 2,000 years late. Who are the celebrities of today? Celebrities, movie stars, athletes. Why? Because they have the status, they have the image, they have the glory and the honor that every single one of us wants. Which is what? Money, power, beauty, fame, human applause. Because those are the things that we go to find security. If you look good, You're going to find security in that. If you have money, if you have power, and just on goes the list. I mean, America's fascinating. We're so used to it, but if you step back and you look at other cultures, we just idolize the people that have those things. And it's because we want them themselves, and it's really because that's what we find our security in. It is all about status and image. We don't mamble on like the philosophers back then, but we still boast in the same thing. So if that's the way we think, here's the deal. Yeah, Christianity makes no sense. Why would you want to go follow Jesus? Jesus is going to seem irrelevant. What does Jesus have to do with the good life? What does Jesus have to do with beauty, money, and power, and sex, and on and on and on? I mean, the Jewish rabbi, Jesus, he says, you got to deny yourself to follow me. He says, lose your life to gain it. That is the polar opposite of what culture says today. Culture says, hey, you want to gain your life? Go get beauty, money, and power, fame, and honor, and status. Do you see what's going on here? It's no wonder that Jesus and Christianity and the cross look foolish. It's because it's not what we expect. We expect this category over here. And so no wonder we think Jesus is a buzzkill. But is he? I find it fascinating. You read interviews of celebrities who are in this category who have everything. And what do most of them say? They're not happy. Why do you think they go to rehab? Filled with anxiety, depression disorders. Does beauty, money, and power give you the good life? We think it does, but it doesn't actually deliver. Here's a fascinating quote. I came across this 2 years ago, and it has never left my mind. David Letterman, right, former host of the Late Night Show. Here's what David Letterman says. This is eye-opening to me. So here's someone who's got acceptance, status, celebrity, got it all. I don't know if he's beautiful, but anyways. Here's what he says. Every night, you're trying to prove your self-worth. It's like meeting your girlfriend's family for the first time. You want to be the absolute best, the wittiest, smartest, most charming, best-smelling version of yourself. If I can make people enjoy the experience and have a high regard for me when I'm finished, it makes me feel like an entire person. If I've come short of that, I'm not happy. And listen to this. How things go for me every night is how I feel about myself for the next 24 hours. I don't know about you. That terrifies me. Because basically what he's saying is that my happiness, my well-being is dependent on the applause I get every night. That is a scary place to be in. I mean, I can't imagine living like that. It seems foolish, dumb, and offensive. Let me let you in on a secret. This is where I was convicted. Preachers deal with the same thing. Right? We can put on the facade, we can put on the face. You know what pastors struggle with, people who preach? Oh, Mark, your sermon was so great. You just want all the compliments, all the acceptance, all the applause, because we usually, unfortunately, put our identity in that. Here's the problem with that. I'm never gonna get enough compliments. I'm always gonna want one more. Here's the greater problem with that. When I do get criticism, and if you're gonna get criticism as part of the job, it'll crush you. You're never gonna get enough compliments, and then one note of criticism, poof, day over. Here's the problem the cycle of image and status and all these things is that it's a never-ending cycle. It doesn't stop. Our culture's so-called wisdom, status, popularity, applause, beauty, money, power is actually the stupid thing. It's foolishness. Here's the good news. The cross actually gives you the wisdom and the power that you have been searching for your whole life. The status, the identity that you've been looking for, and you've been trying to find it and stuff over here. The cross says it's actually right here in the cross. You want wisdom? You want power? You want status? You want acceptance? How about the God of the universe on the cross looking down upon you and saying, I love you. You are my son and daughter. Money? It's great. There's nothing wrong with money. But the minute that you go to it for status, it is absolutely foolish. The cross gives you the status that you've been looking for your whole life. You see, the gospel, at first, it appears to be offensive, but actually, it's the stuff over here that's offensive. Why? Because it robs you of your true life. You want wisdom and power? Run to the cross. Now, this, and then we'll be done here. The Jewish category, the church, the religious people, you're not off the hook. And that's a lot of us in here. I don't think that we see the need for the cross because we're just so used to it. Just an icon. And I think the other thing is, I'm not sure if we think we need it. We're all good people, right? Here on a Sunday morning, volunteer. I mean, maybe you volunteer in the kids, which is like, man, you really got a crown on your head there if you do that. Yeah, you tithe 10%. You're in a life group. You're good. You're a good moral person. Hey, maybe you haven't been divorced. I mean, whatever. Name whatever the situation, but you got a good moral life. I'm good to go. Yeah, that's for kind of like, the other people. Here's the problem with this crowd. What happens when somebody who's a nobody comes in and gets the same things that you're used to getting? Here's what I mean. Let me be real this morning. These are typical stereotypes. I apologize for that, but you'll get the point. If a homeless person came in here, I can absolutely guarantee you there'd be some people turning their heads. Why? Because they're not one of you. What if we're having communion up here and we're giving them communion first? Let me use another stupid stereotype. What if someone came in just reeking of alcohol, drugs, whatever, just name every stereotype. I can absolutely guarantee you some of us in here would be turning our heads. Why? Oh, well, they need grace, but not me. Stumbling block. You're going to trip over it. Here's the message of the cross for you. The foot of the cross is equal. The cross is the giant leveler. The cross is all about not what you've done or haven't done, but about what Jesus has done for you. Here's how you know that you finally get the gospel. When you understand that grace is offensive. You will only know that grace is offensive when there's someone who isn't as moral as you gets grace and it makes you mad. Until we get that, the cross in some respects should be a stumbling block. Grace is radical and offensive. We just throw the term around and we're so used to it. For us this morning, just like the church in Corinth, the cross reminds us that actually by ourselves, and this sounds kind of bad, I'm sorry, but all of us in here, we're nobodies. When it comes down to it, I'm a nobody. But through Jesus crucified, I'm a somebody. Because through the cross, Jesus looks down upon me and you, and he says, you know what? I see you as a son and daughter of the King. You are loved and accepted no matter what you do or don't do. Doesn't matter where you've come from. Doesn't matter what family you're a part of. Doesn't matter what you've done. You are loved and accepted because of the cross. Grace is offensive. It's a scandal. It doesn't make sense. But that is the wisdom and power of God. I'm going to invite the music team back up here. Palm Sunday it's interesting because Palm Sunday is really all about God not meeting our expectations. They wanted a military king, and they got a king on a donkey. It was foolishness. Didn't make sense. There's no wisdom in it. There's no power in it. And for us this morning, I don't know where you're at, but what in your life do you have an image of God that he's not meeting? What things in your life look foolish, moronic? What things are you looking to for status and acceptance? How can the cross give you what you ultimately need and want? Let's pray. Holy Spirit, have your way this morning. We come before you in humility. We know that we're nobodies, but we also know that through you, we are somebody. I pray that the message of the cross, the unexpected message of the cross, stirs our hearts this morning.